She lined them up with precision that bordered on obsession. Every rifle spotless, serial numbers gleaming under the fluorescent light. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. Wipe, oil, reassemble, rack. The armory staff called her the Ghost because she was silent, efficient, and utterly unremarkable. But what nobody knew was that each weapon she serviced had once been in her hands in the bloodiest combat zones of the past decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Morgan Ellis didn't stand out at first glance. Medium height, practical haircut that stayed within regulation, and a perpetual expression of quiet focus. She wore the standard-issue khaki uniform of civilian contractors at Fort Braxton, with sleeves always rolled precisely 3 turns up her forearms. No jewelry, no flashy watch, nothing that called attention to herself. Just another anonymous face in the sprawling military complex where thousands moved with purpose every day. The armory was her domain, a long rectangular building with concrete walls and metal shelving units stacked with weaponry from standard issue, M4 South to specialized sniper systems. It smelled of gun oil, metal, and industrial cleaner. The kind of place where conversations happened in murmurs and everything had its exact place. Morgan preferred it that way. The order. The routine. The quiet. "Ellis, I need these cleaned by end of shift," Sergeant Rollins would say, dropping a crate of disassembled rifles on her workstation without waiting for acknowledgement. She never complained, never argued about timelines or workload. She'd simply nod, pull on her nitrile gloves, and get to work with a precision that bordered on artistry. "Yes, Sergeant," was all she'd say before diving in. Her economy of movement was hypnotic. The way she'd field strip an M4 in seconds flat, fingers dancing across the components with a familiarity that came from thousands of repetitions. Most armory techs develop this skill over time, but Morgan had arrived with it fully formed. What the sergeant didn't know, what nobody at Fort Braxton knew, was that Morgan could disassemble, clean, and reassemble these weapons blindfolded because she'd done exactly that. In pitch-black tunnels, during sandstorms, while wounded, while enemy fire crackled overhead and her team's survival depended on functioning equipment. Each rifle that passed through her hands carried a history that only she could read. This N24 sniper rifle? She'd used one exactly like it to eliminate a high-value target at 800 meters during a black operation in the mountains. That standard M4 with the slightly worn pistol grip. She'd carried one through 3 combat tours, trusted it with her life more times than she could count. But no one at Fort Braxton knew Captain Morgan Ellis, decorated Special Operations Officer. They only knew Morgan, the quiet armory tech who kept to herself and never joined the others for drinks after shift. The woman who ate lunch alone and whose personnel file was so unremarkable it might as well have been generated by AI. That's exactly how she wanted it. After 12 years of classified operations, after losing 3 teammates in an ambush that left her with a titanium rod in her femur and shrapnel permanently embedded near her spine, Morgan had made a choice. Not retirement, she couldn't imagine civilian life, but a step sideways into the shadows. A place where she could still serve, still contribute, but without the weight of command that had nearly broken her. "Hey Ellis, what's your story anyway?" The new hire, Corporal Jenkins, asked one day, leaning against her workbench while she methodically cleaned a stack of sidearms. "You ex-military or something?" Morgan's hands never paused in their rhythm. "Something like that," she said with a small smile that revealed nothing. The corporal waited for elaboration that never came. "Well, I'm headed out. Some of us are grabbing beers at O'Malley, if you want to join," he offered, already knowing what her answer would be. "Thanks, but I've got plans," she said, the same response she'd given every time for the past 2 years. As Jenkins walked away, Morgan's eyes flipped briefly to the M110 semi-automatic sniper rifle in the corner of the room, the one reserved for special operations training. Her mind flashed to the identical weapon she'd used 4 years ago during an extraction gone sideways in Kandahar. The weight of it against her shoulder as she provided cover fire while her team carried out an injured intelligence officer. The metallic taste of fear in her mouth. The perfect stillness she'd achieved despite the chaos. 7 confirmed targets in under 3 minutes. It had earned her a commendation that remained sealed in classified records. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Morgan returned her attention to the pistol in her hands. These weapons passing through the armory would go on to training exercises, to qualifying ranges, to deployment preparations. Not to the kinds of operations she'd conducted, the ones without names, without acknowledgement, sometimes without even existing on paper. She preferred it this way, handling the tools without bearing the responsibility of what would be done with them. Her routine was clockwork. Up at 0500 for a 5-mile run, regardless of weather. Shower, protein shake, at her station by 0700, work through lunch. Leave precisely at 1700 unless there was a backlog of weapons needing maintenance. Home to her sparse 1-bedroom apartment just outside base. Dinner, usually something simple and protein-heavy. Reading technical manuals or military history until 2200, then sleep if the nightmares allowed it. Weekends meant longer runs, meal prep for the week ahead, and occasionally a drive to the mountains where she'd hike alone, testing the limits of her partially healed body. She spoke to her mother every Sunday evening for exactly 30 minutes. The conversation never varied. Yes, she was eating well. No, she wasn't dating anyone. Yes, the weather was fine. No, the job wasn't too stressful. What she never mentioned was how she sometimes caught herself scanning rooftops for snipers. How she still sat with her back to the wall in public places. How she kept a go bag packed by her front door with 3 different forms of identification. $5,000 in cash, and a satellite phone programmed with numbers that officially didn't exist. It was during a routine Tuesday in April, when the first crack appeared in the carefully constructed wall between Morgan's past and present. Colonel James Harrington strode into the armory, his presence immediately commanding attention. Morgan recognized him instantly, though she'd never met him in person. He'd been the commanding officer for Operation Silverback, the mission that had ended her field career. Her hands continued their mechanical work on the DMR she was servicing, but her senses heightened to full alert. Was this coincidence? Or had she been found out? Sergeant Rawlins, Harrington called, his voice carrying that distinctive timbre of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Sir," Rawlins appeared from his office, back straightening instinctively. "I understand you're short-staffed for the weapons qualification next week. HQ sent me to evaluate your needs," Harrington said, eyes scanning the armory with the practiced efficiency of someone cataloging assets. Morgan kept her head down, focusing on the weapon in front of her. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, just as it had been when she'd lain motionless in a hide for 72 hours tracking a target. She felt rather than saw Harrington's gaze move over her, then pause. Did he recognize her? Her hair was different now, shorter, and she'd lost the muscle mass that came from carrying full combat loads through mountain passes. But something in his expression shifted. "Who's that?" the colonel asked, nodding toward Morgan's workstation. "Ellis, been with us about 2 years. Civilian contractor. Keeps to herself but does the work of 3 people," Rawlins replied with a shrug. Harrington approached her station, and Morgan had no choice but to look up. Their eyes met, and for a fraction of a second, she saw recognition flicker across his face before being carefully masked. But he said nothing about their shared past, simply nodded and asked, "How many weapons can you process in an 8-hour shift, Ms. Ellis?" Depends on the type and condition, sir, she answered, voice neutral, professional. Roughly 30 rifles or 45 pistols if they're just routine cleaning. Fewer if there are repairs needed. He nodded, studying her with an intensity that would have made most people uncomfortable. Morgan met his gaze steadily. Impressive numbers, he said finally. Sergeant Rollins is lucky to have you. Thank you, sir, she replied, then returned to her work, dismissing him as effectively as if she'd turned her back. It was a subtle power move that only someone familiar with her real rank would recognize. A reminder, I know that you know, but this is where I am now. The colonel lingered a moment longer, then turned away to continue his inspection with Rollins. Morgan forced herself to maintain the same rhythm, the same breathing pattern, but internally, her mind was racing through contingencies. Would he report her presence? Would he understand her need for anonymity? After they'd moved to the far end of the armory, Morgan permitted herself a single glance in their direction. Harrington was watching her over Rollins' shoulder. He gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. Acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even understanding. The rest of the day passed with excruciating slowness. Morgan cleaned 17 more rifles, logged everything meticulously, and left exactly on time, refusing to alter her routine even slightly. As she walked to her car in the fading daylight, she scanned the parking lot with practiced casualness. No one following. No unusual vehicles. But her instincts told her something had shifted. At home, she double-checked her security system, a custom setup far more sophisticated than her pay grade would suggest. Then she opened the false bottom of her dresser drawer and removed a secure phone she hadn't used in nearly 2 years. She didn't activate it, not yet. But she placed it in her go-bag, just in case. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay awake replaying every mission she'd conducted under Harrington's command. He'd been fair, competent, respected by the operators under him. He'd visited her in the hospital after the ambush, had recommended her for the Silver Star that she'd received in a private ceremony attended by only 7 people. But he was also a career military man who believed in chain of command and proper channels. Would he see her current position as dereliction of duty? Or would he understand that some warriors needed to step back from the front lines without leaving the fight entirely? The next morning, Morgan arrived at the armory at her usual time, half expecting to find military police waiting for her. Instead, there was only Rollins, looking more irritable than usual. "Ellis, you're on loan," he announced without preamble. "Colonel Harrington requested you specifically for a special project. 2 weeks temporary duty. Report to Building 237 at 0900. Morgan's face betrayed nothing, but her mind was calculating rapidly. Building 237 housed advanced weapons testing and specialized training for deploying units. It had restricted access and was rarely mentioned in general base communications. What game was Harrington playing? "Yes, Sergeant. I'll finish the current batch before I go," she replied, moving to her station. "Already reassigned." "Corporal Jenkins will handle it," Rollins said, studying her with new curiosity. Must have made quite an impression on the colonel. Morgan simply nodded and gathered her personal tools, a set of precision screwdrivers and specialized brushes she'd acquired over years of weapons maintenance. Tools that were far superior to standard issue. Another small detail that might have hinted at her background to anyone paying close attention. As she walked across the base toward Building 237, Morgan maintained situational awareness out of habit. 3 surveillance cameras tracked her progress. A security patrol passed by, the junior officer nodding respectfully. A helicopter from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, flew overhead, the distinctive sound of its modified rotors immediately recognizable to her trained ear. She arrived 5 minutes early, presenting her ID to the security checkpoint. The guard scanned it, then made a call. "Ellis is here," he said to someone on the other end, then nodded. Go on through. Second door on the right. The hallway was cool, quiet, and smelled of fresh paint and gun oil. Morgan approached the designated door, knocked once, and entered without waiting for a response, a subtle assertion of confidence. Colonel Harrington stood beside a table laden with disassembled components of what appeared to be a prototype weapon system. Alone. Captain Ellis, he said quietly, using her real rank for the first time. It's just Ellis now, sir, she corrected him, standing at parade rest out of ingrained habit. Harrington studied her for a long moment. 2 years, he said finally. 2 years cleaning weapons in an armory when you could have been commanding your own team. Waste of talent. With respect, sir, it's not a waste if it's a choice, Morgan replied, meeting his gaze directly. Is that what this is? A choice? Or are you hiding, Captain? The question hit with precision accuracy, finding the vulnerability in her armor. Morgan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Both, sir, she answered honestly. After Silverback, I needed distance. Harrington nodded slowly. I read the after-action report. What was left of it after the redactions? You carried Santiago 3 miles with a broken femur and shrapnel in your back. Anyone would have done the same, Morgan said flatly. That's where you're wrong. Harrington gestured to the components on the table. Do you know what this is? Morgan approached, examining the parts with a practiced eye. Looks like a modified SAR-H with an experimental suppression system and custom trigger assembly. Semi-automatic marksman variant, probably designed for urban operations where sound discipline is crucial. Harrington's eyebrows raised slightly. You've been keeping up with weapons development. Hard habit to break, she admitted. I need someone with your expertise to test and evaluate this system before we field it. Someone who understands both the technical specifications and the real-world application. Someone who won't sugarcoat feedback because they're chasing a promotion. He paused. Your name came up in the database when I searched for qualified personnel on base. Morgan's expression tightened. My current assignment is classified. At my clearance level, nothing is truly classified. Harrington replied with a small smile. Your secret is safe, Captain. This isn't me trying to drag you back. This is me recognizing the right person for a specific job. Morgan looked at the weapon components again, feeling the familiar pull. The desire to hold a precision instrument, to test its limits, to provide feedback that might save lives in the field. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a controlled environment where her expertise could make a difference without putting her back into the situations that had nearly broken her. 2 weeks? She confirmed. 2 weeks. After that, if you want to go back to being a ghost in the armory, that's your call. No one outside this room needs to know who you really are. Morgan considered for a long moment, then nodded once, decisively. I'll need the complete design specifications and manufacturing tolerances. And I want to run the field tests myself, not supervise some green lieutenant who's never heard a shot fired in anger. Harrington smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Already arranged. Welcome back to the land of the living, Captain. Even if it's just temporary. For the first time in 2 years, Morgan felt something stir within her. Not exactly purpose, she'd never lost that. Not pride, that had been both her strength and downfall. Perhaps it was simply recognition. The acknowledgement that sometimes the most valuable warriors weren't those on the front lines, but the ones who stepped back, who brought their hard-won experience to bear in quieter, equally essential ways. She picked up the trigger assembly, feeling its weight and balance. Her fingers, which had cleaned hundreds of similar components, moved with practiced precision as she examined the craftsmanship. For a moment, she was transported back to her team, huddled in a safe house, performing weapons maintenance by flashlight while rain hammered on the roof. The camaraderie, the shared purpose, the absolute trust. She'd lost that. But perhaps she'd found something else. A different kind of service. A different kind of worth. "Let's get started," she said, rolling up her sleeves. The scars on her forearms, souvenirs from a dozen different operations, caught the light. She didn't try to hide them anymore. They were part of her story, just like the rifles she'd cleaned for 2 years, while nobody realized each one was a reflection of her own combat experience. Some battles were fought in distant lands under classified orders. Others were fought daily in quiet armory rooms and testing facilities, ensuring those who still carried the fight forward had every possible advantage. Both mattered. Both saved lives. Morgan Ellis had finally found her peace in that understanding. And for now, that was enough. The prototype weapon felt natural in Morgan's hands, like reconnecting with an old friend. For the next 3 days, she worked in meticulous isolation, breaking down the modified CRH, analyzing each component, documenting every observation in a technical journal that grew increasingly detailed. The firing pin engagement was milliseconds faster than standard issue. The custom barrel rifling created a tighter grouping at distance. The suppression system reduced both sound and visible signature beyond anything currently fielded. Colonel Harrington checked in periodically but gave her space to work. He understood operators at her level needed autonomy, not micromanagement. On the 4th day, Morgan requested access to the testing range. "Paperwork's already filed," Harrington said, sliding a security badge across the table. "You have unrestricted range access for the duration of the project." Morgan nodded, pocketing the badge. This level of clearance would typically require weeks of bureaucratic navigation. Harrington was pulling strings, creating a bubble of exception around her. Part of her appreciated the efficiency. Another part wondered about his true motives. The shooting range was empty when she arrived at 0530, the sun barely cresting the horizon. Precisely how she preferred it. No distractions, no curious eyes, just her, the weapon and targets at varying distances. She methodically set up her equipment, including a specialized chronograph to measure muzzle velocity and a high-speed camera to capture the weapon's cycling action. For 4 hours, she put the prototype through its paces. 3-round bursts. Rapid fire sequences. Precision shots at maximum effective range. After each sequence, she made minute adjustments, recalibrated, and tested again. Her movements were economical, practiced, lacking the theatrical flourishes of range instructors, but carrying undeniable expertise that could only come from real-world application. "Impressive grouping," a voice observed from behind her. Morgan didn't startle. Her situational awareness had registered the approaching footsteps long before they spoke. She turned to see a man in civilian clothes, early 40s, with the unmistakable bearing of special operations. "Can I help you?" she asked, neither friendly nor hostile, simply direct. "Major David Chen," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "I'm leading the team that designed the modification package you're testing." Morgan accepted the handshake briefly. "Ellis, just Ellis?" Chen asked, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "For now," she replied, turning back to the weapon. Chen moved closer, examining the target downrange. 5 shots in a grouping so tight they formed a single ragged hole at 300 meters. Harrington mentioned he'd found someone special for the evaluation phase. Didn't mention you were a ghost. Morgan's hand paused momentarily on the barrel, which was still warm from firing. Ghost? That's what they call operators who disappear into the system after distinguished service. Not dead, not retired, just reassigned to the shadows. Chun's voice held no judgment, only recognition. Takes one to know one. Morgan studied him more carefully now. The way he carried himself, favoring his left side slightly. The faded tan line where a wedding ring had once been. The careful positioning that kept his field of vision maximized. "Mogadishu?" she asked quietly. "Among other places," Chun confirmed with a slight nod. Until this, he gestured vaguely toward his right hip, made fieldwork impractical. Now I design instead of deploy. Morgan nodded, understanding perfectly. Many operators found their way into support roles after injuries rendered them unable to meet the punishing physical standards of special operations. It was adaptation, not surrender. The trigger assembly has excessive travel, she said, shifting the conversation back to the weapon. Fine for precision work, problematic for CQB scenarios. Chun moved closer, interest peaked. Show me. For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side, testing, adjusting, discussing modifications with the shorthand efficiency of two professionals who didn't need explanations for basic concepts. They spoke the same language, not just English, but the specialized dialect of people who had bet their lives and others on the reliability of their equipment. You've carried a seer in combat, Chin observed as Morgan disassembled the bolt carrier group with practiced ease. Among other things, she replied, using his own phrasing. The over-rotation on the charging handle, you spotted it immediately. That's not something you learn from technical manuals. Morgan said nothing, focused on her work, but her silence was confirmation enough. Your file must be interesting reading, Chun continued, a subtle probe. My file says I'm a civilian contractor with weapons maintenance experience, Morgan replied flatly. That's all it needs to say. Chun studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. But when you're done evaluating the hardware, I'd appreciate your thoughts on tactical application. The kind of insights that don't make it into official reports. Morgan paused, considering. This wasn't just professional curiosity. Chun wanted the perspective that only came from using similar systems when lives depended on it. The kind of feedback that could make the difference between mission success and failure for whoever eventually carried this weapon into the field. I'll provide a complete assessment, she agreed finally. As they packed up the equipment, Chun hesitated. A few of us are getting together tonight. Nothing formal. Just some people who've been where you've been. No questions asked, no war stories required. Just, he searched for the right words, a different kind of company than you'll find at the regular base hangouts. Morgan's immediate instinct was to decline. Isolation had become her comfort zone. But something in Chun's offer resonated. Unspoken understanding that some experiences created bonds that didn't require explanation. O'Reilly's the pub 3 miles off base, Chun continued. Back room, 2,000 hours. Come, don't come, entirely your call. With that, he gathered his notes and left, not waiting for her answer. It was a courtesy Morgan appreciated, no social pressure, no expectation. Just an open door she could choose to walk through or not. That evening, as Morgan changed out of her work clothes in her sparse apartment, she found herself considering Chun's invitation. 2 years of voluntary isolation had served its purpose, creating the distance she needed from her former life. But isolation, like any tactical position, had diminishing returns over time. At 2015, Morgan pushed open the heavy wooden door of O'Reilly's. The main bar was crowded with the usual mix of off-duty soldiers and local civilians, but she moved past them toward the back of the establishment. A hallway led to a private room where a group of about 8 people were gathered around a large table. No uniforms, nothing to indicate military affiliation, yet Morgan recognized the posture, the situational awareness, the way each person had positioned themselves with sightlines to the exits. Chun noticed her first, raising his glass slightly in acknowledgement, but making no announcement of her arrival. No spotlight, no attention exactly how Morgan preferred it. She took an empty seat at the corner of the table, nodding to the others but offering no introduction. A woman across from her, late 30s with a scar bisecting her right eyebrow, slid a beer toward Morgan. First one's on me, she said simply. Michaels. Ellis, Morgan replied, accepting the drink with a nod of thanks. Conversation flowed. Around her some technical shop talk about equipment modifications. Some discussion of changes to base operations. Occasional mentions of former teammates now deployed elsewhere. No one pressed Morgan for details about herself. No one asked about her service record or why she was now testing prototype weapons instead of carrying them in the field. It was the most comfortable social situation Morgan had experienced in years. These people understood boundaries because they had their own. They respected silence because they had things they didn't discuss. They recognized the signs of someone who had stepped back from the edge because many of them had made similar choices. As the evening progressed, Morgan found herself speaking more, contributing to technical discussions, even sharing a wry observation about base security protocols that earned appreciative laughter. Not once did she feel the need to explain or justify her current position. Not once did she catch the pitying look she'd feared might come with reintegration into social circles. By the time she left, shortly after 2200, Morgan had collected several phone numbers and an invitation to a weekend range session with Chun and Michaels to further test the prototype modifications. She'd also gained something less tangible but more valuable, a reminder that stepping away from combat didn't mean complete disconnection from the community that understood her. Back at Building 237 the next morning, Morgan worked with renewed focus. The prototype was showing promise, but still needed refinements. She documented each issue methodically, supporting her observations with data from the range tests. Around midday, Colonel Harrington stopped by for an update. "Progress?" he asked, scanning the disassembled components spread across the workbench. "Getting there," Morgan replied, handing him a tablet with preliminary findings. "Suppression system exceeds specifications. Accuracy is exceptional. Reliability under rapid fire sequences needs work." Harrington reviewed her notes, nodding occasionally. "Thorough as always, Captain." "Ellis," she corrected again, but with less edge than before. "Ellis," he acknowledged with a slight smile. "I understand you met Major Chun yesterday." Morgan glanced up from the barrel she was examining. "Is that relevant to the evaluation?" "Perhaps not to the weapon," Harrington conceded. "But to the broader objective, yes." Morgan set down the barrel, giving him her full attention. "And what broader objective would that be, sir?" "Reintegration," he said simply. "Not back to field operations. I understand that chapter has closed. But there are other ways to serve that make full use of your experience." "I'm serving now," Morgan pointed out. "The armory functions more efficiently than it has in years." "You're hiding," Harrington countered, voice firm but not unkind. "Doing work well below your capabilities because it's safe, because it doesn't require you to engage with others who recognize what you've accomplished and what you've sacrificed." Morgan's expression hardened. "With respect, sir, that's not your call to make." "No, it isn't," he agreed readily. "The choice is entirely yours. But choices should be made with full awareness of the alternatives." He placed a folder on the workbench beside her. Morgan made no move to open it. "What's this?" she asked, wariness evident in her tone. "A proposal. After this evaluation concludes, there's a position opening in the weapons development advisory group. They need experienced operators to evaluate field applicability of new systems before they go into production. Limited travel, no combat deployment, but real impact on the effectiveness of those still in the field." Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You orchestrated this whole thing." "The random selection for prototype testing. Meeting Chun." Harrington didn't deny it. "I recognized an asset being underutilized." 2 years is enough time to process what happened in Silverback, Ellis. Not enough to bury yourself for good. "You don't know what I'm processing," Morgan said, an edge creeping into her voice. "No," Harrington acknowledged. "I don't. But I know what happens when exceptional operators withdraw completely after trauma. I've lost good people that way, not to enemy action, but to isolation and the belief that their value ended when their field service did." He gestured to the prototype weapon. "Every insight you provide on that system could save lives downrange. Every flaw you identify is one less malfunction in combat. That's still service, Ellis. That still matters." Morgan said nothing, but her hands had stilled on the components, a sign she was listening despite her reservations. "The position doesn't require you to share your history," Harrington continued. "Your expertise speaks for itself. But it would put you in contact with others who understand what you've carried and why you've chosen to step back. Like Chun and his team." "I'll consider it," Morgan said finally, neither accepting nor rejecting outright. Harrington nodded, apparently satisfied with that much. "The offer remains open, regardless of your decision on this specific role. You've earned the right to choose your path forward, Captain. All I'm suggesting is that there are more paths than you might have considered." After he left, Morgan sat motionless at the workbench, thoughts churning behind her composed exterior. The folder remained untouched beside her. Opening it would mean acknowledging possibilities beyond the careful boundaries she'd established for herself. It would mean considering a future where her past wasn't something to hide, but something that gave her unique value in a different arena. Eventually, she returned to the prototype, losing herself in the mechanical precision of the work. But as she reassembled the firing mechanism with practiced efficiency, Morgan found herself considering the weapons she'd carried in the field. Each had been developed, tested, and refined by people she'd never met, whose expertise had directly impacted her ability to complete missions and bring her team home safely. Now she could be on the other side of that equation. Still serving, still contributing, but from a position that honored both her expertise and her need for a different kind of service than direct combat. That evening, rather than returning to her apartment, Morgan drove to a hiking trail outside the base perimeter. The spring air was cool against her face as she followed the path upward, away from roads and buildings, into the silence of the forested hillside. As the trail steepened, she felt the familiar pull in her partially healed leg, the reminder of limitations she'd once refused to acknowledge. At the summit, Morgan found a large rock outcropping and sat, looking out over the sprawling military complex below. Lights were coming on as dusk approached, illuminating the orderly grid of buildings, the parade grounds, the airfield where helicopters were being prepared for night training exercises. From this distance, it all seemed so organized, so purposeful. Each component, each person, each unit, fulfilling their function within the larger system. For 2 years, Morgan had deliberately placed herself at the periphery of that system, doing necessary but largely invisible work. Had it been recovery, as she'd told herself? Or retreat? The question lingered as she watched the base transition from day to night operations. Somewhere down there, Chun and his team were continuing their work on systems that would eventually reach the hands of operators like she had been. Their work mattered. It had direct impact. It was service of a different kind, but service nonetheless. The folder Harrington had given her was in her backpack. Morgan hadn't planned to bring it, yet here it was. With deliberate movements, she removed it and opened it in the fading light. The position description was straightforward: technical advisor to the Weapons Development Advisory Group, focusing on field application of prototype systems. Required qualifications included extensive combat experience with various weapons platforms and the ability to translate that experience into practical feedback for design teams. What caught Morgan's attention wasn't the job description, but the team roster included in the back of the folder. Names she recognized. Operators from various branches and units, all with distinguished service records, all now contributing their expertise in ways that didn't require them to carry weapons into combat zones. Some, like Chun, had transitioned after injuries. Others had simply reached the point where the physical and psychological toll of repeated deployments had necessitated a change. None had fully left service. They'd simply found different ways to apply their hard-won knowledge. As darkness fell completely, Morgan closed the folder and stood, feeling the stretch and pull of scar tissue along her back and leg. The physical reminders of silverback would always be with her, just as the psychological impacts would. But perhaps those weren't just limitations to be managed. Perhaps they were also qualifications for a different kind of contribution. The hike down was easier than the climb, though Morgan took it slowly, mindful of the uneven terrain and the darkness. By the time she reached her car, she'd made no firm decision about Harrington's offer, but she had decided on her next step in the prototype evaluation. The following morning, Morgan arrived at Building 237 earlier than usual. She'd spent the night reviewing her notes and formulating a comprehensive testing protocol that would push the modified SCAR-H to its limits and beyond. If this weapon was going to save lives in the field, it needed to be tested by someone who understood exactly what operators would demand from it. Chun arrived shortly after, carrying a case of additional components. He nodded to Morgan, noting the intensity of her focus without comment. "I want to run a full environmental stress test," she said without preamble. Sand, mud, water immersion, temperature extremes. Not the standardized protocol real-world conditions. Chun's eyebrows raised slightly. "That's well beyond the current testing phase requirements." "It's what's needed," Morgan replied simply. "Unless you'd prefer to wait until it fails in the field to discover its limitations." Rather than being offended, Chun smiled. "This is exactly why Harrington wanted you on this. The official testers follow the manual. You follow the mission." Morgan didn't acknowledge the compliment, already focused on preparing the testing equipment. "I'll need access to the environmental simulation chamber." "Already arranged," Chun said, sliding a security badge across the workbench. Harrington anticipated you might want to expand the testing parameters. For the next 3 days, Morgan subjected the prototype to conditions that would make most weapons engineers wince. She buried it in sand, submerged it in muddy water, froze it overnight, then immediately transitioned it to high-temperature testing. Between each environmental challenge, she field-stripped the weapon, documented wear patterns and failure points, then reassembled it and tested functionality. Chun and his team monitored the process, occasionally suggesting modifications, but mostly observing with professional interest as Morgan methodically identified weaknesses in the design. Her feedback wasn't theoretical, it was grounded in specific combat scenarios, where similar issues had created life-threatening situations. "The extractor spring loses tension after extended immersion," she noted, demonstrating the issue. "In jungle environments or extended maritime operations, that creates a critical failure point approximately every 150 rounds. The standard testing protocol only requires functionality after brief immersion," one of Chun's junior engineers observed. "Standard isn't good enough," Morgan replied, voice level but firm. "Not for the operators who will depend on this system when communication is compromised and extraction isn't immediate." The engineer started to object, but Chun raised a hand, silencing him. "She's right. We designed to exceed standards, not merely meet them." He turned to Morgan. "What's your solution?" Without hesitation, Morgan reached for a tablet and sketched a modified extractor design with reinforced spring housing and improved drainage channels. It wasn't just a theoretical improvement, it was a practical modification, born from experience with similar failures in the field. "Implement this," she said, "then we'll retest under the same conditions." Chun studied the design, nodding slowly. "Elegant solution. Simple enough for field maintenance with existing tools. We'll have a prototype of this modification by tomorrow." As the testing continued, Morgan found herself increasingly engaged not just with the technical aspects, but with the team itself. These weren't just engineers designing systems in isolation, they were professionals, committed to creating tools that would function reliably in the worst possible conditions. Their dedication resonated with Morgan's own ethos from her field days. Excellence wasn't optional when lives depended on your performance. By the end of the second week, The prototype weapon had been transformed. Morgan's insights had led to 17 distinct modifications, each addressing specific vulnerabilities that standard testing protocols would have missed. The final version was now undergoing its last evaluation, a marathon firing test, designed to simulate sustained combat operations under adverse conditions. Morgan stood at the firing line, protective gear in place, methodically working through magazine after magazine. 1,000 rounds, no cleaning, no maintenance, continuing until failure or completion. Chun and his team monitored from behind ballistic glass, recording data and observing wear patterns. Colonel Harrington had joined them, watching not just the weapon but Morgan herself. 800 rounds in, most systems would show significant degradation in accuracy and reliability. The modified SCAR-H continued functioning with minimal deviation from baseline performance. Morgan's expression remained focused, professional, but there was something else visible now, a quiet satisfaction, as the weapon performed exactly as she'd ensured it would. When the final magazine was expended, Morgan safed the weapon and stepped back from the firing line. The barrel glowed with residual heat, but the action had cycled cleanly throughout the test. She field stripped it there on the range, examining each component for stress and wear. "Extractor shows minimal wear," she noted, voice carrying to the observation area through the communication system. Gas system remained clear. No carbon fouling in the critical areas. Chun approached, now that the firing had ceased. "That's unprecedented reliability for this platform under these conditions," he said, examining the disassembled components with professional appreciation. "Your modifications made the difference." Morgan nodded, neither accepting nor deflecting the acknowledgement. It wasn't about credit. It was about creating a system that would function when failure meant death. As they collected the test data and components, Harrington joined them on the range floor. "Impressive work," he said, addressing both Morgan and Chun. "The final report will recommend immediate integration of all suggested modifications into the production model." Chun nodded, clearly pleased, then excused himself to brief the rest of his team, leaving Morgan and Harrington alone on the now quiet range. "Your 2 weeks are up tomorrow," Harrington observed, watching Morgan methodically clean the test weapon despite the fact that it would be completely disassembled and analyzed by the engineering team. "Yes, sir," she acknowledged, hands never pausing in their practiced routine. "Have you given any thought to what comes next?" Morgan set down the cleaning rod, finally meeting his gaze directly. "I have." Harrington waited, allowing her the space to continue in her own time. "I'm not ready to step fully back into the light," Morgan said finally. "But I'm also not content to spend another 2 years hiding in the armory." "Those aren't the only options," Harrington pointed out gently. "No," Morgan agreed. "They're not." She reached into her pocket and removed a folded paper, the application for the position with the Weapons Development Advisory Group. It was completed, signed, missing only the final authorization. "I can be of service without carrying a rifle into combat," she said, a statement that seemed directed as much at herself as at Harrington. "My experience has value beyond my ability to engage targets." Harrington accepted the application with a nod of acknowledgement. "The position would be effective immediately," he said. "If that's what you want." "It is," Morgan confirmed. "With one condition." "Which is?" "I maintain my anonymity outside the team. No public recognition, no official acknowledgement of my previous service record. I work with Chun and his group because they understand the need for distance, but I don't become a recruitment poster or a success story for the brass to parade around." Harrington considered this, then nodded. "Acceptable. Your contributions will speak for themselves, without needing your biography attached." With that settled, Morgan returned to cleaning the weapon, a ritual that had become second nature over years of service. But now, each movement carried new significance. This wasn't just maintenance performed out of duty or habit. It was the application of hard-won knowledge, that would protect others who still carried the fight forward. That evening, Morgan received a text from Chun, team gathering at O'Reilly's to celebrate project completion. 2,000 hours. Your presence requested, but not required. 2 weeks ago, she would have declined without hesitation. Now she found herself considering it differently. These people, Chun, Michaels, the rest of the development team, they inhabited the same gray area she did. Not quite in, not quite out. Finding purpose in the space between their former roles and civilian life. At 20:30, Morgan walked into O'Reilly's back room to find the team already engaged in relaxed conversation. Chun spotted her first, raising a glass in acknowledgement. The others followed suit, creating a moment of quiet recognition that required no speeches or elaborate welcomes. Morgan took an empty seat beside Michaels, who slid a beer toward her without comment. The conversation resumed its natural flow, technical discussions mixed with the occasional war story, now told with enough distance to find the humor in situations that had once been deadly serious. "So I hear you're joining the advisory group," Michaels said during a lull, her voice pitched for Morgan's ears only. "Word travels fast," Morgan observed, neither confirming nor denying. Michaels shrugged. "Small community. Especially for those of us who've stepped sideways rather than out." "Is that how you see it?" Morgan asked. "Stepping sideways? Beats the hell out of falling down," Michaels replied with a wry smile. "Took me 3 years to figure that out. Spent the first year after my last deployment drinking myself numb every night, convinced I was worthless because I couldn't go back out there." Morgan studied her beer, listening. "Then I realized something," Michaels continued. "Every piece of gear I carried, every system I depended on, they were all designed and tested by people who understood the mission. People who'd been there, who knew what was at stake. I could be one of those people. Different contribution, same ultimate purpose." The insight resonated with Morgan in a way she hadn't expected. Her 2 years in the armory hadn't been wasted. They'd been necessary transition time. But they had also been a holding pattern, a pause rather than a new direction. "How's the adjustment?" Morgan asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Michaels considered the question. "Challenging in ways I didn't expect. Easier in others. I miss the adrenaline sometimes, the clarity of purpose. But I sleep better. And I know the work still matters, it's just a longer line between what I do and the impact it has." As the evening progressed, Morgan found herself increasingly engaged in conversation, not just with Michaels but with others around the table. They shared technical insights, swapped stories of equipment failures in improbable circumstances, debated the merits of various modifications currently in development. It wasn't the brotherhood of combat units she'd once known. That bond forged in shared danger couldn't be replicated. But it was something valuable nonetheless, a community of professionals who understood both the technical aspects of their work and the human cost of getting it wrong. By the time Morgan left, well past midnight, something had shifted in her perspective. The isolation she'd maintained for 2 years had served its purpose, creating necessary distance from the trauma of Silverback. But isolation, like any tactical position, became a vulnerability if maintained too long. Connection selective, appropriate connection with others who understood was not weakness but strength. The next morning, Morgan arrived at the armory to find Sergeant Rollins waiting, a mixture of curiosity and respect in his expression. "Ellis," he greeted her. "Heard you've been reassigned." "Effective today," she confirmed, beginning to gather her few personal items from the workstation that had been hers for 2 years. Rollins watched her pack with undisguised curiosity. "Must have been some impression you made on Colonel Harrington. Not many civilian contractors get tapped for special projects." Morgan offered a non-committal as she collected her precision tool set. "You know," Rollins continued, "I always wondered about you. The way you handled those weapons, it wasn't just technical knowledge. It was like you knew them from the inside out. Morgan paused, considering how to respond. 2 weeks ago, she would have deflected, changed the subject, maintained the careful distance she'd established. Now she found herself choosing a different approach, not full disclosure, but not complete evasion either. "I've had experience," she said simply. Rollins nodded, seeming to understand there was more to the story than he'd ever know. "Well, whoever gets you next is lucky to have you. This place won't be the same." It was perhaps the closest thing to a compliment Rollins had ever offered. Morgan acknowledged it with a nod as she finished packing. "If you ever need anything maintained properly," she said, allowing a hint of humor to surface, "you know where to find me." Building 237, Rollins confirmed. "Where they keep all the classified projects and apparently all the people too good for regular assignments." Morgan actually smiled at that, a small expression, but genuine. Something like that. As she walked out of the armory for the last time, Morgan felt a momentary twinge of something like nostalgia. The space had been her sanctuary, her hiding place, her self-imposed exile. For 2 years, she'd found a kind of peace in the simple, repetitive tasks of weapons maintenance, disconnected from the high-stakes pressure of field operations. But she wasn't leaving that peace behind. She was carrying it forward into something new. The skills remained valuable. The attention to detail remained essential. The commitment to excellence remained unchanged. Only the context was shifting, expanding to include collaboration with others who shared her dedication to getting it right. Building 237 looked different to Morgan now as she approached it, security badge in hand. Not just a temporary assignment, but a new operational base. Not just a testing facility, but a place where her experience could be translated into tangible improvements for those still in the field. Chun met her at the security checkpoint, a tablet under his arm containing the day's project briefings. "Ready to make things that don't break when they matter most?" he asked by way of greeting. "That's the plan," Morgan replied, falling into step beside him as they moved through the security doors. The development floor was a hive of focused activity engineers at workstations, prototype components being tested at various stations, large screens displaying test data and design specifications. Chun led Morgan to a workspace that had been prepared for her, a desk positioned with clear sight lines to the exit, a consideration she appreciated. Equipped with multiple high-resolution monitors and a secure terminal. "Your first official task," Chun said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Review the preliminary designs for the next-generation designated marksman rifle. Focus on the operating system and reliability under adverse conditions." Morgan opened the folder, immediately noting potential issues with the bolt carrier design. Already, her mind was cataloging scenarios where the current configuration might fail, comparing it to systems she'd carried in environments ranging from Arctic to desert to jungle. "Initial impressions?" Chun asked, watching her scan the technical drawings. "The gas system is overcomplicated," Morgan said, without hesitation. "Too many potential failure points for field maintenance. And the bolt-locking lugs won't handle sustained rapid fire without premature wear." Chun nodded, making notes on his tablet. "That's exactly the perspective we need. The engineers focus on theoretical performance under ideal conditions. You focus on what happens when everything goes wrong at the worst possible moment. Because that's when it matters most," Morgan replied, a statement of fact rather than bravado. "Precisely." Chun gestured to the broader development floor. "Everyone here is technically proficient. What they lack is the perspective that only comes from having your life depend on these systems functioning perfectly when everything around you is chaos." Morgan continued reviewing the designs, already seeing modifications that would improve reliability without compromising performance. This wasn't so different from what she'd been doing in the armory, identifying potential issues, implementing solutions, ensuring weapons would function when needed. The scale was different, the impact more widespread. But the fundamental purpose remained the same, supporting those who carried the fight. Over the next few hours, Morgan immersed herself in the technical aspects of the project, making detailed annotations on the designs and conferring with the engineering team when clarification was needed. By mid-afternoon, she had compiled a comprehensive list of recommended modifications, each tied to specific operational considerations. During a break, Morgan found herself at the coffee station alongside Michaels, who was working on a different project across the development floor. "Settling in?" Michaels asked, filling her mug with the notoriously strong coffee Building 237 was known for. "Getting there," Morgan replied, a more honest answer than she would have given 2 weeks ago. "First day's always the strangest," Michaels observed. "Feels like you should be gearing up for deployment instead of sitting at a desk reviewing technical specs." Morgan nodded, acknowledging the truth in this. "Different kind of mission, same ultimate objective." "That's the spirit," Michaels said with approval. "Took me months to see it that way." "You're ahead of the curve." As they returned to their respective projects, Morgan found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. From elite operator to anonymous armory technician to specialized advisor, not the career path she'd envisioned when she'd first qualified for special operations, but one that now felt right in ways she hadn't anticipated. The trauma of Silverback wouldn't disappear, the physical scars, the nightmares, the hypervigilance that remained her constant companion. But those weren't just burdens to be managed. They were also hard-won insights that gave her work unique value. Her understanding of weapon systems wasn't academic or theoretical, it was visceral, immediate, forged in environments where failure meant death. Late afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Morgan's workspace. Colonel Harrington arrived with another officer Morgan didn't recognize, an older man with the quiet confidence of senior command and the subtle indicators of someone who had spent significant time in special operations before moving up the chain. "Ellis," Harrington greeted her. "I'd like you to meet General Malcolm Reeves, Program Director for Next Generation Combat Systems." Morgan stood, military bearing still ingrained despite her civilian status. "Sir," the general extended his hand. "No need for formalities, Ellis. I've reviewed your work on the Scar-Uch modifications. Exceptional insights. The kind that only come from field experience." Morgan accepted the handshake, noting the calluses that suggested Reeves still maintained his weapons proficiency despite his rank. "Thank you, sir. I understand you've requested anonymity regarding your service record," Reeves continued, getting directly to the point. "May I ask why?" It was a question Morgan had anticipated, but still found difficult to answer concisely. After a moment's consideration, she opted for directness. "The work should stand on its own merits, sir. My background might create expectations or assumptions that distract from the technical assessments." Reeves studied her with the evaluating gaze of someone accustomed to measuring not just words, but the character behind them. "Fair enough. Though I suspect there's more to it than professional modesty." Morgan met his gaze steadily but offered no further explanation. Some aspects of her journey remained private, not from shame or secrecy, but because they were still being processed, still being integrated into her understanding of herself. "Your conditions are accepted," Reeves said finally. "Your official designation will be technical advisor, with appropriate security clearance for the projects you'll be evaluating. No reference to your previous service record in any public documentation." "Thank you, sir," Morgan replied, genuine appreciation in her voice. As the general prepared to leave, he paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "You know, Ellis, sometimes our greatest contributions come after what we perceive as our defining moments. The quiet work, the unglamorous, unheralded improvements that save lives in ways that never make the reports. That's a legacy too." The insight struck Morgan with unexpected force. For 2 years, she'd measured herself against her field operations, seeing her current work as necessary, but somehow lesser. Reeves was offering a different perspective, that her contributions now could be as meaningful as any action she'd taken in combat, perhaps more so for their broader impact. After Reeves and Harrington departed, Morgan returned to the designated marksman rifle designs with renewed focus. Each annotation, each suggested modification represented potential lives saved, missions succeeded, operators returning home. Not because she was there in the field with them, but because she had ensured their equipment wouldn't fail when they needed it most. As the day drew to a close, Sheen approached her workstation, reviewing her completed assessments with professional appreciation. This level of detail, it's exactly what we need. The engineers can calculate optimal performance specifications all day, but they can't tell us how a system will behave after 3 days in a sandstorm with no maintenance. That's where experience fills the gaps, Morgan acknowledged. Speaking of which, Chun continued, we're conducting field trials next month for the modified Cigar H. 2 weeks at the desert training facility. If you're interested, we could use someone with your expertise on site. The invitation represented another step beyond the boundaries Morgan had established for herself. The armory had been safe, contained, predictable. The advisory role pushed those boundaries while still maintaining distance from field operations. Actual field trials, even in controlled training environments, would mean further re-engagement, more visibility, more direct connection to the operational world she'd stepped away from. 2 months ago, she would have declined immediately. Even 2 weeks ago, she might have hesitated. Now Morgan found herself considering it differently, not as a threat to her carefully maintained distance, but as an opportunity to ensure her insights were implemented correctly. I'll be there, she decided, commitment replacing hesitation. The modifications need to be verified under actual field conditions. Chun nodded, clearly pleased. I'll add you to the team roster. And Ellis, he paused, seeming to search for the right words. Thank you. Not just for the technical work, but for stepping back into the arena, even in this limited capacity. It matters. As Morgan packed up at the end of her first day in her new role, she glanced around Building 237 with a sense of cautious optimism. This wasn't the path she'd expected to walk, but it was one that honored both her experience and her need for a different kind of service than direct combat. The weapons she'd cleaned for 2 years in anonymity had been tangible connections to her past. Each one had reminded her of similar systems she'd carried into combat, creating a bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming. Now that bridge was expanding, allowing her to cross further into identity without abandoning what made her expertise valuable in the first place. Outside, the spring evening was clear and mild. Morgan paused on the steps of Building 237, taking a moment to appreciate the simple pleasure of completion, a day's work done well, with purpose and meaning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new systems to evaluate, new opportunities to translate hard-won experience into improvements that would protect those still in the fight. For now, that was enough. Not the adrenaline rush of combat operations, not the intense camaraderie of special operations teams, but something valuable nonetheless, the quiet satisfaction of service continuing in a different form. The knowledge that each rifle that had passed through her hands in the armory had been a step on this journey, not an end, but a transition to something that honored her past while creating space for a different future. The desert training facility stretched across 50,000 acres of unforgiving terrain, a harsh landscape of rock formations, sand dunes, and extreme temperature fluctuations that had broken lesser equipment and tested the limits of even the most resilient operators. Perfect conditions for the field trials of the modified Cigar H system. Morgan stood at the edge of the makeshift firing range, squinting against the morning sun as she observed the test team preparing the weapons for the day's evaluation. 6 modified rifles, each configured slightly differently to test specific aspects of the new design. She'd personally inspected each one the previous evening, making minute adjustments to ensure consistency across the test platforms. "Quite different from the armory, isn't it?" Chun commented, appearing beside her with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to Morgan, who accepted with a nod of thanks. "Different backdrop, same fundamental task," she replied, taking a sip of the strong black coffee. "Ensuring reliability under adverse conditions." Chun smiled at her characteristically pragmatic response. "True, though the view's better, even if the accommodations are worse." The accommodations consisted of basic field shelters, glorified tents with cots and minimal amenities. For the engineering team, it was a challenging departure from their climate-controlled labs. For Morgan, it felt oddly familiar, a callback to countless field operations where comfort was irrelevant and functionality was everything. Over the past month since joining the Weapons Development Advisory Group, Morgan had settled into a new routine. Days spent reviewing designs, conferring with engineers, testing prototypes. Evenings occasionally spent with Chun, Michaels, and others from the team at O'Reilly's, gradually building connections that respected her boundaries, while providing the human contact she'd denied herself for 2 years. The desert trials represented another step in her gradual re-emergence. Here, she wasn't just providing feedback on designs, she was actively demonstrating proper tactical employment of the systems, showing the engineers firsthand how their creations would be used in the field. "First test group is ready," announced Corporal Sanchez, the young Marine who'd been assigned as liaison to the test team. Morgan nodded, setting down her coffee cup and moving toward the firing line. Today's evaluations focused on reliability under rapid fire sequences after exposure to fine sand, a condition that had caused issues with earlier iterations of the design. 6 operators from various units stood ready, each with one of the test rifles. They weren't special operations, just regular infantry with solid shooting fundamentals. Morgan positioned herself behind them, observing their handling of the weapons with a critical eye. "Remember," she called out, voice carrying easily across the range, "these aren't your standard issue. The cyclic rate is approximately 15% faster, and the recoil impulse is more vertical than horizontal. Adjust your stance accordingly." The operators nodded, making subtle shifts in their positioning based on her guidance. Morgan watched, noting with approval how quickly they adapted. Good operators were always students, always learning, regardless of their experience level. "On my mark, execute the prescribed firing sequence," she directed. "Full magazine, controlled pairs, no breaks between target transitions." At her signal, the range erupted with the distinctive sound of the modified rifles. Morgan moved behind the line, watching not just the targets but the weapons themselves, how they cycled, how the operators managed them, any signs of hesitation or malfunction. 5 of the 6 rifles performed flawlessly. The 6th, modified with an experimental lightweight bolt carrier, experienced a failure to extract on the 27th round. Morgan noted it immediately, stepping forward as the operator cleared the malfunction. "Stop," she said calmly but firmly. "Let me see." The operator, a sergeant with 3 combat deployments, stepped aside respectfully as Morgan examined the weapon. With practiced efficiency, she cleared the chamber, checked the extractor, and identified the issue. "Extractor spring tension is insufficient with the lightweight carrier," she observed, speaking loudly enough for Chun and the engineering team to hear from their observation position. "Under sustained fire, the heat expansion creates just enough tolerance stacking to prevent positive extraction." Chun approached, notebook in hand. "Consistent with your prediction during the design phase," he noted. "You said the weight reduction would compromise the extraction reliability." Morgan nodded, already field stripping the rifle to examine the components more closely. "The concept is sound, but the execution needs refinement. The spring rate needs to be increased by approximately 20%, And the extractor claw needs a more aggressive angle to compensate for the reduced reciprocating mass. One of the engineers joined them, examining the failed component with professional interest. "We can modify the design and have new parts fabricated within 48 hours, he said, already sketching the proposed changes. "Do it," Sean authorized. "Ellis, any other adjustments while we're making changes?" Morgan considered for a moment. "Increase the gas port diameter by 0.05 millimeters. That will ensure reliable cycling, even with the stronger extractor spring." The engineer made the note, clearly impressed by the specificity of her recommendation. This wasn't theoretical knowledge, it was the kind of precise adjustment that only came from intimate familiarity with how these systems performed under stress. As the testing continued throughout the morning, Morgan found herself increasingly engaged not just with the technical aspects, but with the operators themselves. They recognized her expertise, sought her guidance on handling techniques, listened attentively when she explained the reasoning behind specific design choices. "Ma'am," one of the Marine sergeants approached during a break, "the way you described the recoil management, it made a real difference in my follow-up shots. Where did you learn that technique?" Morgan hesitated only briefly before answering. "Experience," she said simply. Then, surprising herself, she added, 3 tours in specialized units before transitioning to technical advisory roles." The sergeant nodded, a new respect evident in his expression. "Thought so. You don't talk about recoil management like someone who just studied it. You talk about it like someone who's depended on it." It was a small moment of recognition, of connection across the divide between her former and current roles. Not the full disclosure she'd avoided for years, but an acknowledgement that her past remained relevant to her present contributions. By mid-afternoon, the desert heat had intensified to over 110 degrees. The test team rotated operators to prevent fatigue from affecting the results, but Morgan remained constant, observing every sequence, documenting every performance metric. Her focus never wavered despite the punishing conditions. "You need to hydrate," Chen insisted during a brief pause, handing her a water bottle. "Even desert operators take breaks." Morgan accepted the water with a small smile. "Force of habit," she acknowledged. "When you're responsible for a team's effectiveness, you don't rotate out until everyone's accounted for." "This isn't a combat operation," Chun reminded her gently. "No," Morgan agreed, "but the results will affect combat operations. That deserves the same level of commitment." As the day's testing concluded, Morgan gathered the team for a debrief. Engineers, operators, and support staff formed a semicircle around her as she summarized the findings, successes, failures, and modifications needed before the next phase. "The fundamental design is sound," she concluded. "With the adjustments we've identified, this system will provide a significant advantage to operators in the field. It will function when other platforms fail, maintain accuracy under sustained fire, and require less field maintenance between engagements." Chun nodded his agreement. "Tomorrow we'll test extreme temperature transitions and post-water immersion functionality. For now, good work everyone. Especially you. Ellis, your insights made the difference between identifying these issues here versus discovering them downrange." As the group dispersed, Morgan remained at the firing line, watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in hues of orange and gold. The day's work had been physically demanding, mentally engaging, and deeply satisfying in ways her time in the armory had never been. There, she'd been hiding, maintaining a connection to her past without fully engaging with it. Here, she was leveraging that past, transforming hard-earned experience into tangible improvements. Footsteps approached from behind, familiar enough that Morgan didn't tense or turn. Michaels joined her at the firing line, arms crossed as she surveyed the same sunset. "Word's spreading," Michaels said without preamble. "About who you are, what you did before. Nothing specific, just that you weren't always a technical advisor." Morgan had expected this. Operating in the field, even in a training capacity, meant increased visibility. "Does it matter?" she asked. "Depends," Michaels replied thoughtfully. "Does it matter to you?" The question deserved consideration. For 2 years, Morgan had guarded her identity fiercely, equating anonymity with security, with distance from the events of Silverback. But that equation was changing, evolving as she herself evolved. "Less than it used to," she admitted finally. Michaels nodded. "That's progress. Took me 3 years to start talking about my previous role without feeling like I was describing someone else." "I'm not there yet," Morgan cautioned. "No one's asking you to be," Michaels assured her. "Just noting the change. 6 months ago, you were a ghost in the armory. Now you're here, running field trials, sharing expertise that can only come from where you've been. That's significant movement, whether you acknowledge it or not." The observation was accurate. Each step, from the armory to the advisory role, from technical reviews to field trials, represented movement away from isolation and toward re-engagement. Not returning to combat operations, but finding a middle path where her experience remained valuable in a different context. "We're heading into town for dinner," Michaels continued. "Real food, not the mess tent slop. You should join us." 6 months ago, Morgan would have declined immediately. 2 months ago, she might have considered it, but ultimately made an excuse. Now she found herself nodding. "I could eat something that isn't rehydrated or covered in sand." Michaels smiled, a genuine expression that reflected understanding of what this simple acceptance represented. "Truck leaves in 20. Don't be late or Chun will give your seat to one of the engineers, and you'll be stuck listening to them debate spring coefficients all night." As Michaels walked away, Morgan took a final moment to appreciate the desert landscape, now deepening toward twilight. There was a certain stark beauty to it, unforgiving, demanding respect, but rewarding those who understood its nature. Not unlike the path she'd been walking since Silverback. The small town 30 minutes from the training facility offered limited options, but the steakhouse the team selected provided a welcome respite from field conditions. Morgan found herself seated between Chun and one of the senior engineers, engaged in conversation that flowed naturally between technical discussions and more casual topics. "The modified extractor performed better than I expected today," the engineer commented as their meals arrived. "Your spring rate adjustment was precisely what it needed." Morgan nodded, cutting into her steak with methodical precision. "It's about understanding the system holistically, not just as individual components. The bolt carrier, extractor, and gas system work as an integrated unit under stress. Change one parameter, and you affect the entire operating cycle. That's what separates your feedback from standard test reports," Chun observed. "You don't just identify issues, you understand why they occur and how they relate to actual operational conditions." The conversation shifted as the meal progressed, moving from technical details to personal backgrounds and interests. Morgan participated more than she would have months earlier, though still selectively, sharing general experiences without delving into classified operations or the specifics of Silverback. As coffee was served, Chun raised his cup slightly. "A toast," he proposed, "to successful field trials and to team members who make excellence their standard rather than their goal." The sentiment resonated around the table, glasses and cups lifting in acknowledgement. Morgan participated with a small smile, feeling a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since before her injury. Not the intense brotherhood of combat teams, but a different kind of connection, one based on shared purpose rather than shared danger. The following week of field trials tested the modified weapon systems under increasingly demanding conditions. Morgan directed evaluations in dust storms, after water immersion, during rapid temperature changes, and under sustained fire scenarios that pushed the platforms to their limits and beyond. With each test, each adjustment, each success and failure, Morgan found herself more deeply engaged. This wasn't just technical evaluation, it was applying her hard-won knowledge to protect those who still carried the fight. Every modification she suggested, every improvement she identified represented potential lives saved, missions succeeded, operators returning home. On the final day of testing, an unexpected visitor arrived at the training facility. A helicopter landed on the designated pad near the command center, and Colonel Harrington emerged. Accompanied by a figure Morgan recognized immediately, General Malcolm Reeves, the program director who had approved her anonymity condition. They approached the firing line where Morgan was supervising the final evaluation sequence, a torture test designed to push the weapons to catastrophic failure to identify their absolute limits. "Ellis," Harrington greeted her. The general wanted to observe the final trials personally. Morgan nodded respectfully. "Sir, we're just completing the maximum stress testing protocol." Reeves watched with evident interest as the operators ran the modified rifles through rapid-fire sequences that would have caused standard platforms to fail within minutes. The modified SCAR-H systems continued functioning long past expected tolerance limits. "Impressive performance," the general observed as the sequence concluded. "Your modifications have created a significant capability enhancement." "Thank you, sir," Morgan acknowledged. "The team deserves the credit. I just provided operational context for their technical expertise." Reeves smiled slightly. "False modesty doesn't suit you, Ellis. I've reviewed the test data and modification records. The critical improvements bear your fingerprints clearly." As the operators secured the weapons and the engineering team collected final performance data, Reeves gestured for Morgan to join him and Harrington for a private conversation away from the group. "I have a proposal for you," Reeves said without preamble once they were out of earshot. "The Next Generation Infantry Weapons Program needs an operational advisor, someone who can bridge the gap between the engineers who design the systems and the operators who will use them in the field." Morgan maintained her composed exterior, but her mind was already analyzing the implications. Such a position would mean increased visibility, greater responsibility, more direct impact on future weapons development across multiple platforms. The role would maintain your condition of anonymity regarding your service record, Reeves continued, anticipating her concern. "But it would place you in a position to influence not just individual weapon systems but the overall direction of development for the next decade of infantry equipment." "Why me?" Morgan asked directly. "There are other qualified advisors with similar backgrounds, but none with your particular combination of technical expertise and operational experience," Harrington interjected. "And none who have demonstrated the ability to translate that experience into practical improvements the way you have with this project." Morgan considered the offer carefully. It represented another step away from the anonymity of the armory, another level of re-engagement with the broader mission. Not returning to combat, but expanding her sphere of influence in ways that could affect thousands of operators across all service branches. "I need time to consider it," she said finally. Reeves nodded, unsurprised. "Of course. The position remains open for the next 30 days. Consider it carefully, but also consider this. Your experience, including Silverback, has value beyond what you may recognize. Sometimes our greatest contributions come after what we perceive as our defining failures." The insight struck with unexpected force. Morgan had viewed Silverback as the end of her operational career, the breaking point that had necessitated her retreat to the armory. But what if it had instead been a transition point, redirecting her contribution rather than ending it? As Reeves and Harrington departed, Morgan returned to the test area where Chun and the team were preparing the equipment for transport back to the base. The modified SCAR-H rifles, now proven, refined, and ready for production, represented tangible evidence of that possibility. "Everything okay?" Chun asked, noting her thoughtful expression. Just considering next steps, Morgan replied. Ah, Chun nodded with understanding. Reeves offered you the program advisor position. Morgan raised an eyebrow. Word travels fast. Small community, Chun reminded her with a smile. Especially at our level. As they worked together to secure the test equipment, Chun continued casually, you know, when I first transitioned from field operations to development work, I struggled with the change in identity. I defined myself by my role for so long that stepping away felt like losing part of myself. Morgan listened, recognizing parallels to her own journey. But eventually I realized something important, Chun said. The skills that made me effective in the field, attention to detail, ability to anticipate problems, understanding how systems perform under stress, those same skills make me valuable here. Different application, same fundamental purpose, protecting those who carry the fight. It was a perspective Morgan had been gradually approaching over the past months. The weapons she'd cleaned in the armory for 2 years had been more than just assignments. They'd been tangible connections to her operational past. Physical reminders of the skills and knowledge she'd accumulated over years of service. Now, those same weapons represented something different. Opportunities to apply that knowledge in ways that extended far beyond what she could have accomplished as a single operator, no matter how skilled. Each modified system, each improved component, each enhanced capability would multiply her impact across thousands of operators, facing the same challenges she had confronted. That evening, as the team prepared to return to Fort Braxton, Morgan stood alone at the edge of the training facility, watching the desert sunset one last time. The harsh landscape that had tested their equipment so thoroughly was beautiful in its uncompromising honesty. It demanded respect, accepted no excuses, revealed weaknesses without mercy. Much like combat operations. Much like life after them. The path forward was becoming clearer. Not a return to who she had been before Silverback, but not a permanent retreat into anonymity either. Something new, a role that honored her experience while acknowledging her evolution beyond it. A way to serve that leveraged everything she had learned, everything she had survived, everything she had become. 3 weeks later, Morgan stood in Building 237, reviewing the final production specifications for the modified SCAR-H before they were transmitted to the manufacturing facility. The system that would soon be in operators' hands across multiple service branches bore the unmistakable imprint of her expertise, more reliable, more adaptable, more resilient under adverse conditions. Signing off? Chun asked, approaching her workstation with 2 cups of coffee, a ritual that had become familiar over the past months. Morgan nodded, applying her digital signature to the authorization form. Production begins next month. First units deploy for field testing with operational units 60 days later. And you'll be overseeing that process as program advisor, Chun observed, a statement rather than a question. News of her acceptance of Reeves' offer had spread quickly through their small community. Someone needs to ensure the production models maintain the specifications we established during testing, Morgan replied with characteristic understatement. Chun smiled, recognizing the deflection for what it was, not false modesty, but a continued preference for letting her work speak rather than claiming personal credit. You know, he said thoughtfully, what you've achieved here goes beyond technical improvements to a weapon system. You've demonstrated a truth that many operators struggle to accept, that stepping back from direct combat doesn't diminish your value to the mission. Morgan considered this as she reviewed the final design specifications. There was truth in Chun's observation, though she wouldn't have framed it that way herself. Her journey from the armory to this moment hadn't been about proving her value. It had been about rediscovering it in a different context. The rifles I cleaned for 2 years, she said finally. Each one represented both my past and my potential future. I just needed time to recognize that connection. Chun nodded, understanding the significance of this rare moment of personal reflection from someone who typically kept such insights private. "And now?" he prompted gently. Morgan closed the file, decision made, path forward clear. "Now I ensure that the next generation of operators has every possible advantage when they face the same challenges I did." Different role, same mission. As she walked through Building 237 toward her next meeting, a briefing with the production team that would manufacture the system she'd helped perfect, Morgan reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From elite operator to anonymous armory technician, to specialized advisor to program director, not the path she'd envisioned, but one that now felt right in ways she hadn't anticipated. The weapons she'd cleaned in silence for 2 years had been more than assignments. They'd been bridges between her past and her future. Physical manifestations of the expertise that remained valuable, even as the context for applying it changed. Each rifle had carried a history that only she could read, a connection to operations she'd conducted and challenges she'd overcome. Now, those same weapons represented something more, a legacy that would extend far beyond her individual service, protecting operators she would never meet in conditions she understood intimately. Not through her presence in the field, but through her influence on the tools they carried. It was a different kind of impact than she'd once valued, less immediate, but potentially more far-reaching. Not the adrenaline rush of direct action, but the deeper satisfaction of applying hard-won wisdom to protect others from preventable failures. Morgan Ellis had spent 2 years cleaning rifles that reminded her of combat, each one a silent testimony to experiences she couldn't share. Now, she designed rifles that would shape the future of combat operations, each one carrying forward the lessons she'd learned at such high cost. Different mission. Same purpose. Same commitment to excellence when it mattered most. And in that realization, she had found not just purpose but peace, the quiet confidence that came from knowing her experience. Even the painful parts continued to serve those who still carried the fight forward. Not despite her transition from the battlefield, but because of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.